301 and Title 46 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 4, to investigate the circumstances surrounding the implosion of the Titan with the loss of 5 lives on June 18, 2023, while conducting deep-sea operations in the vicinity of the RMS Titanic wreck site. I have previously determined that OceanGate Incorporated is a party in interest to this investigation. OceanGate is represented by the law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton. As such, OceanGate has a statutory right to employ counsel to represent them, to cross-examine witnesses, and to have witnesses called on their behalf. I will examine all witnesses at this formal hearing under oath or affirmation, and witnesses will be subject to federal laws and penalties governing false official statements. Witnesses who are not parties in interest may be advised by their counsel concerning their rights. However, such counsel may not examine or cross-examine other witnesses or otherwise participate in these proceedings. These proceedings are open to the public and to the media. I ask for the cooperation of all persons present to minimize any disruptive influence on the proceedings in general and on the witnesses in particular. An area has been set aside for news media use during the proceedings. The media may question witnesses concerning their testimony given after I have released them from the proceedings. I ask that such interviews be conducted outside of this courtroom. Since the date of the casualty, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and Coast Guard have conducted substantial evidence collection activities, and some of that previously collected evidence will be considered during these hearings. Should any person have or believe they have information not brought forward, but which might be of direct significance, that person is urged to bring that information to my attention by emailing titan@uscg.mil. The Coast Guard relies on strong partnerships to execute its missions, and this Marine Board investigation is no exception. The NTSB provided a representative for this hearing. Mr. Marcel Muse, seated to my far right, is the investigator in charge for the NTSB investigation. Mr. Muse, would you like to make a brief statement?
Yes, good morning. Again, I'm Marcel Muse, the NTSB's investigator in charge assigned to investigate this accident. The NTSB has joined these proceedings to avoid duplicating facts. The NTSB, in the end, will produce its own report separate from the Coast Guard, determine a probable cause, which is required by law, and where appropriate, issue safety recommendations to prevent future accidents.
Thank you. We will now call our first witness of the day, Mr. Fred Hagan, who was a mission specialist on a Titan expedition. Mr. Hagan, please come forward to the witness table, sir. Good morning, sir. I realize we're starting a bit early. Would you like 10 minutes just to get settled and before we begin the proceedings? If I could have 5 minutes. Yes, sir. Well, we'll go into a brief recess and reconvene at 8:45.
Thank you. So I'm not late, right?
This hearing is now back in session. Good morning again, Mr. Hagan. Lieutenant Steele, our recorder for this proceeding, will now administer your oath, sir.
Would you raise your right hand for me, please? Thank you. A false statement given to an agency of the United States is punishable by a fine and/or imprisonment under 18 U.S.C. 1001. Knowing this, do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated.
Sir, Lieutenant Commander Katie Williams is going to start with the questioning today.
Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Hagan.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here with us this morning. As we ask you questions, if you need a break, please let us know. All of my questions are related to your background and your experience as with OceanGate as a mission specialist. Before we begin, I will ask you to please refrain from using any acronyms. If you should use an acronym, I will stop you and ask for you to explain what the acronym means. Could you explain your background and work history before you became involved with OceanGate?
My background is a commercial building contractor and developer, and I specialize in hospitals, build a number of museums. We do multifamily housing, and so I have a background in construction. I did not have a specific background in the deep diving world. I have had a background in searching for missing aircraft and archaeological projects. So I've spent years, found 8 missing World War II airplanes, returned the remains of 18 airmen for burial, and also excavated a Roman shipwreck on the Adriatic coast. So I have had some experience underwater, and I am a diver, but I'm certainly not a professional mariner.
How did you become a mission specialist with OceanGate?
I became a mission specialist because I found, it's a convoluted story, but I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version. I located 2 Corsairs in Lake Sebago that had been sold to Great Britain through Lend-Lease. And as we all know, the Royal Navy never relinquishes title to their materiel, and it occurred to me that the Royal Navy had, so I attempted to salvage them. Being as the bodies of the British pilots were still on board, I was prevented by Great Britain. But during that endeavor, I met a lawyer named Dave Kincannon, who happened to be a lawyer assisting OceanGate. And he had dove numerous times on the Titanic, had been involved in a number of missions. And when I heard that OceanGate was going to descend for the first time in 2021, I approached Dave and told him that I wanted to be on the first mission.
In your opinion, how would you define a mission specialist?
A mission specialist is a individual who is paying to participate in the great adventure of exploring the deep. And a mission specialist is not necessarily qualified in any particular way for that mission, other than that he's helping to fund exploration in the ocean.
So to confirm, to become a mission specialist, did you pay OceanGate any money?
I did.
And what was your, at the time, what was your understanding, or what were you told your payment was for?
Well, I don't remember what I was told, but I remember what I asked. I wanted to be on the first dive to the Titanic and the Titan.
As a mission specialist, were you part of the submersible crew, or were you a passenger?
Well, both. I was a passenger and who was given the latitude to participate in the mission, and I did so. In my case, in my background, I have quite a lot of experience building things, obviously, and I'm mechanically inclined, so I was able to assist. I didn't do any of the, what I would say, critical items, but certainly, tighten bolts on the dome and other things that I would qualify as what we would say in a slang version, monkey work.
Lieutenant Steele, could you pull up Exhibit 029? It's the project execution plan. Sir, it will come up on the screen, but also in front of you, there are exhibit binders if you wanted to see paper. This is Exhibit 029. If you could scroll down to where it says Mission Specialists, and if it's possible, could you zoom into the specific tasks outlined?
I'm sorry, say that again?
I'm sorry, I was talking to Lieutenant
Oh,
Steele.
okay.
Mr. Hagan, were you involved in any of those tasks that are in bulleted form in front of you?
Yes.
Which ones?
Well, they certainly did not want me communicating, so I didn't do that. I wasn't tracking. The menial tasks, cleaning inside, outside the sub, helping with the oil-filled housings, and other tasks as deemed appropriate.
Did you receive any training from OceanGate for these tasks?
I was always working with someone from OceanGate, so I was working at their express direction. I didn't receive outside training. It was more on-site training and guidance. But like I said, they were very menial tasks.
Lieutenant Steele, you can take that exhibit down. And if you could pull up Coast Guard Exhibit 009, the Mission Specialist job description. And if you could scroll down to paragraphs 2 and 3, the physical duties. Mr. Hagan, are you familiar with this document? Or were you provided a similar document?
Yes, I don't know if it's this same document, but I recognize the verbiage.
Were you asked about your color vision or your hearing prior to going on board with OceanGate?
Yes.
And were you given a duty during an emergency while on board?
I have no recollection of that.
Lieutenant Steele, if you could scroll down to the expedition duties.
See it on there. It's just page 3. There's only 4 pages there.
I think, Commander Williams, can we go to a question while the recorder finds that? Next question.
Yes, sir. I can just ask a general question about it. As a mission specialist, were you involved in any of the following assigned duties? Submersible navigation, data logging, media collection, surface communications, or a safety watch?
Safety watch and data collection.
Can you please explain what you did during those times with those duties?
Well, data collection was, I was giving a list of things to track during our descent by the scientist who was on board. And off the top of my head, I don't recall what they were, but I was making notations about the experience and trying to fill in the blanks as they were given to me. The safety watch was just something I think everyone shared, and just, especially when we were towing the submersible, someone had to keep an eye on it to make sure that nothing went awry, so everyone took a turn.
Were you ever asked about physical limitations or overall health prior to your duties as a mission specialist?
Yes, I believe I was.
And Lieutenant Steele, you can pull that exhibit down. How many dives did you participate on with OceanGate?
2 dives where we actually descended.
My next questions are related to the Titan expedition in 2021. According to the dive logs provided by OceanGate, you were on board a dive on July 3rd, 2021 that made it to 1,700 meters. The dive log stated the sub lost starboard thrusters. Are you familiar with this dive?
Yeah, I thought it was on July 2nd, but I'm getting old, so go ahead. Yeah, I was on the dive.
And were you involved in any of the planning meetings for that dive?
Of course.
Can you please walk us through what a planning meeting looked like?
Well, with OceanGate, there was a plethora of planning meetings, so you're always either in a meeting or coming out of one or getting ready for one. So we would have morning meetings and evening meetings, but the planning meeting we would go through in sequence, every 10 or 15 minutes of the pre-launch schedule, and then what would happen while we were down, and then going through a checklist of making sure that everyone had checked each component and signed off, and it was, that was the nature of the meeting.
And were you assigned any tasks for this specific dive?
Well, I was just given a sheet of data by the scientist, and I don't think I was given specific tasks, but they basically accepted me as a member of their team, and we were all basically together, enjoying the experience and making sure that it went smoothly. And they weren't supposed to take mission specialists on this dive because there had been an incident a couple of days before, but I had prevailed upon Stockton. I reminded him that my intent was to be on the first descent, so that's why I was on board.
You just mentioned a previous incident. Can you go into detail what you understood happened? Or were you present for that incident?
I was present.
Can you please talk about that incident?
Well, we attempted to launch the Titan, and we experienced some issues, and when they were pulling it back up onto the deck, I believe what happened was that it came up and the crane was pulling it up the ramp, and it got to a point where it was seesawing. There's the flat plane of the deck, and then there's the angled plane of the ramp, which is fairly steep, probably a little too steep. But again, this was all experimental, and we were feeling our way through it. So it was teetering back and forth, and then the crane operator let it go a little bit too abruptly. And it slammed down on the deck with quite a bit of force. Now, the complicating factor was that a decision had been made to only install 4 of the 18 bolts in the 3,500-pound titanium dome. And that decision was made. I was there when the decision was made. I did not articulate any opinions one way or the other. But the thought was that once the ship went, or the Titan went to depth, that the pressure would be so intense that you didn't need any bolts. You wouldn't be able to pry it off with a jack. So they were trying to minimize the time it took to get the mission specialist out of the Titan after the mission ended. And that decision was made. The problem was no one anticipated that the platform was going to be dropped with such force. And you're also in the North Atlantic, so the ship's going up and down. There's a lot of factors that combine together. The force of the platform hitting the deck of the, was that the Horizon Arctic that you're? Yeah. The Horizon Arctic, it just basically sheared off several bolts, and they shot off like bullets. And as you know, the titanium dome fell off.
Yes, thank you. Did you witness or did you notice any damage to the forward dome?
No, there was no visible damage. It was obviously a very robust structure. It was just the connecting points that severed.
Can you explain why you were allowed to dive when there weren't supposed to be any mission specialists on board?
Well, when I say no one was supposed to, the original mandate was that, okay, we've had an incident, we're going to go down and not take any mission specialists. It wasn't like some legal reality, because this was all operating in an experimental environment. I reminded Stockton that it was my intent to be on the first dive, and that I was comfortable getting in and was willing to accept that risk.
Going back to the dive on July 3rd, or around July 3rd, 2021, can you tell me about this dive and why the dive was aborted?
Yes, I can. And you want me to do so, obviously. Yes, we went down, it was PH, Nargeolet, Stockton, Scott Griffith, and myself. So we were launched, and we, basically blew the air tanks and went down 30 meters, floated the Titan, and we began a descent. Now, you have to remember, this is literally the first descent to depth, other than practice, descents in other locales. So we realized very early on that we had weighted the Titan slightly off balance. And the original intent was to go down nose forward and kind of go down on a long, gradual angle. And we had unfortunately weighted it ass heavy, so it began spiraling. So instead of going down on a gradient, we were going through it wasn't a violent spiral, it was a very slow spiral through the ocean. And we descended through the shades of light until we entered a world of utter darkness, a complete absence of light, as you're aware. And during that descent, we would see various phosphorescent creatures in the inky blackness, and all systems were off except basically a couple LED lights and the little laptop that they were using to send text messages to the surface. So we basically free fell. I believe it was for 2.5 hours. I don't recall the exact timeline, but it was a few hours. And because we were spiraling slowly through the void, we were off course, and we were caught in the currents, and we were in this kind of unusual attitude. So when we were approaching the bottom of the seabed, we received a text message, and again, communications were very erratic. We would lose comms, which was not unusual because of the different, climactic zones in the ocean. It was hard to get signals, but it would come in and out. But we received a text message that we were off course. So at that juncture, we were all discussing all these things together jointly. We decided to throw the thrusters on and correct our course and make our way towards what we believed was the bow. Now, you have to remember that the Titan only has a sonar that can go out about 100 yards. So when you're at the bottom, you're basically operating in the blind until you actually get within 100 yards of anything. So you could actually go down and completely miss the Titanic because it's such a vast area. So, but we were given a heading by the mothership, and we then threw on the port thruster, and when we fired the starboard thruster, it failed to activate. And as everyone in this board, I'm sure, is well aware, electronics, salt water, and extremely intense pressure, they're just not always well, they're not compatible at all. So the starboard thruster failed, and we realized that all we could do was spin around in circles, like making right turns. At this juncture, obviously we weren't going to be able to navigate to the Titanic. So the decision was made to jettison our weights. And there were a number of weights. There were the sandbags that were attached. There were also the pipe weights. And the pipe weights were released mechanically by rocking the Titan back and forth. And we dropped, I believe, 3 of the 4. The 4th one got stuck, so we couldn't get it off. So it took us probably 20 minutes before we actually saw a perceptible rate of ascent that, other than maybe just a couple feet. And then we began ascending, and again, these are just very approximate timelines because I don't exactly remember, but I think it was 3.5 hours to come up to the surface, but it was quite a while. But we came up But, no, we weren't making much time. So we left the port thruster run, and then we began making long spiraling turns, or just long turns to the right during the ascent. So I think we did speed up. So, and I don't remember how long it was. It seemed like a long time. But we got up and got back on the platform, and they filled the tanks. We came up, and then we had to tow it back to St. John for repairs. And the decision was made by Stockton not to put it back on the ship because of the damage that had been sustained on the previous time to take it on deck. So the decision was made to tow it at about 5 to 8 knots.
Since you paid to go to the Titanic, did you get reimbursed since you didn't make it to the Titanic?
No, I did not. I don't believe there was any provision to be reimbursed, but Stockton made it clear that if you did not get to the Titanic, you would get another opportunity. And, eventually, and I can't say I was overjoyed that I went that year and didn't get to the Titanic, but as it turned out, I went back the next year, so I had 2 expeditions basically for the price of one. And you have to remember that this was all in the service of an experimental vessel. Titan, or Stockton, was not necessarily fascinated by the Titanic. What he was trying to do was create a paradigm where he could take people and resources into the abyss, and the Titanic served as this iconic destination that people would pay to go to and help him perfect his technology. I mean, that's really what this was about. Did I answer your question?
You did, thank you. Moving to the Titanic expedition in 2022, according to the dive logs provided by OceanGate, you completed a successful Titanic wreck site dive on the Titan on July 15th, 2022, which we labeled as Dive 80. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Upon surfacing on Dive 80, a loud bang was heard. Do you recall witnessing that?
Do I recall hearing it?
Yes.
Yes, I certainly.
Can you please describe what you heard?
Well, we were ascending, and I don't recall the depth. I think we were fairly close to the surface, but we were still underwater, and there was just a large bang or cracking sound. And of course, sonic events in a submersible are alarming, so we were all concerned that maybe there was a crack in the hull. But it turned out that upon inspection after we got on the ship that the body of the fuselage of the Titan had just jumped in its carriage. So there was no damage.
Did anyone check the real-time monitoring system screen inside the submersible to see if there was any indication by the system that something went wrong?
Of course.
And do you remember witnessing, or is there anything that showed that something went wrong inside?
No, not that I know of. I mean, no one read any data that caused them concern. We were all concerned by the sonic event, but we didn't detect anything on the monitor.
During the debrief, was this loud bang discussed by any OceanGate employees?
It must have been, but I really don't recall. We went out and looked to see what had happened, and I think we determined what had happened. I'm sure it was, but I don't remember discussing it.
Prior to what you were told for the reason for the loud bang, were there any discussions about the possibilities for the loud bang?
Well, yeah, obviously the concern was that maybe the hull had cracked.
Do you know what investigation was done into the cause of the bang? What specifically was looked at?
Well, we physically determined that the fuselage had jumped in the carriage, so that was the logical inference, and there was no sign. I believe at some point, I was not present for the inspection, but I believe the fairings were removed and the hull was inspected, but we had already we had determined to reasonable degree of satisfaction that the hull had jumped in the carriage.
And did anyone ever present to you the real-time monitoring system data that was taken off afterwards?
No, in fairness to OceanGate, I wouldn't have had any clue what I was looking at anyway.
At the time, did you have concerns about the noise?
Well, yeah, you're in a submersible and there's a loud bang. You would have to be brain dead not to be somewhat concerned.
When they told you what the reason was, were your concerns, were you no longer concerned?
I was satisfied by the explanation.
Do you know if anybody else on board voiced concerns about the noise you heard?
On board the Titan?
The Titan or the Horizon Arctic or any OceanGate employees?
Oh, I remember it was widely discussed, and so there was a level of concern. I wasn't all that concerned myself. I'd finished my dive, so I wasn't really that focused on it. So I apologize. I probably wasn't paying that much attention.
Would you have felt safe going down to depth again after that loud bang?
Well, it's an interesting question. Anyone that felt safe going to depths in the Titan was deluded or delusional. It was an experimental vessel. It was clear that it was dangerous. And anyone that wanted to go was either delusional if they thought it wasn't dangerous, or they were just embracing the sense of risk. It's kind of like jumping out of an airplane. You don't do it because it's safe. You do it because it's an adrenaline rush. And yeah, I would have gone back down again. That we weren't going down in search of safety. We were going down in search of adventure and exploration.
What was your overall impression of the safety culture at OceanGate?
The way I would describe, Stockton Rush was a very interesting individual, and he was a brilliant man. He was an inventor, he was an aeronautical engineer, had flown experimental airplanes, had built an experimental submersible. So this was a man who was engaged in high-risk endeavors and was comfortable with a level of risk that most people would not tolerate. At the same time, Stockton made a very conscious and astute effort to maintain a perceptible culture of safety around a high-risk environment. And by that, I mean that there was a very detailed set of steps taken to abort a dive, for instance. We had what we call anomalies, which were seemingly minor events that had no real significant bearing, but if just some little issue that popped up. If there were a certain number of anomalies, it constituted a strike, or if there was a major, something that you would consider a more major impact, that could constitute a strike on its own. If you got the 3 strikes, they aborted the dive. Anyone on the ship, including the cook, had the ability to say that we're aborting the dive for whatever reason they thought. So I'm not sure how to better illuminate that reality for you, but other than to say that it was a high-risk endeavor in which a dedicated attempt was made to adhere to a culture of safety.
You used the term perception of safety. So it was your opinion that
It wasn't a safe, this was not, it was not safe diving in the Titan, and it was never supposed to be safe. And if it was safe, then you might as well just get in a trolley car and ride around town. But it wasn't supposed to be safe.
Thank you. That concludes my questions.
Okay.
Sir, Lieutenant Commander Emmons now has questions for you.
Good morning, Mr. Hagan.
Good morning.
How did the payments work for your dives as a mission specialist? Like, did you write a check? Did you wire? Who did you write the check out to? How did that work?
Well, I certainly didn't write a check. I believe, I don't remember who we sent the money to, but I received an email giving me directions on where to wire the funds. I forwarded the email to one of my secretaries, and she wired the funds. I I don't even remember exactly how much it was, but it was wired to, and I don't remember who we wired it to. I assume it was the OceanGate, but I honestly don't know. I wasn't, I mean, that was just an incidental thing to me. I wasn't paying that much attention.
Were you aware of a refund policy at OceanGate? You briefly mentioned it, but from what you were told the refund policy was?
I'm not aware of a refund policy.
Were you ever required to get a physical or a medical exam before your dives with OceanGate?
I was asked to get a physical.
And did you conduct the physical?
Yes.
And did you have to show them proof of that physical?
I mean, my memory's not exactly clear. I believe that I emailed them a physical report, but again, that's, I'm a little foggy. I'm getting old. You'll have to excuse me.
You had stated earlier that you conducted some training with OceanGate members.
Yes.
Lieutenant Steele, can you pull up Coast Guard Exhibit 101, which this is the 2023 Mission Specialist Crew Agreement, but I just want to see if you were provided with a similar document. And please go to page 5. Were you ever provided a similar document? We can scroll to the top so you can read the title if it looks familiar, but it's basically a crew agreement that they sent to the mission specialists.
I'm sure it looks familiar, but I probably just gave it a cursory review.
And you're on page 5. Okay. Under there on this second paragraph, I believe, there we go, thank you. It states, I understand that as a member of the expedition crew, I will need to complete substantial training prior to the start of the expedition, up to 14 hours depending on prior maritime experience. Did you receive or conduct similar amount of time training?
Mr. Neubauer, is this a document that we've established Mr. Hagan would have seen? I believe this is 2023 Expedition Mission Agreement.
Yes, ma'am, it is. I asked if he saw a similar agreement.
Okay, but
Right,
just
and
to-
he
but-
said he doesn't recall, and he
Okay.
hasn't read it. So maybe we can ask if he recalls this.
Yes, and I think to frame it, sort of this is a later document for 2023. If you want to take a moment to review it and then say if it looks familiar.
I just read it. Yeah, I recall that we were to receive training. Now, in terms of, you mean training, well, it says prior to the start of the expedition. So we received training on site, obviously, but prior to the start of the expedition, we held a series of kind of like webinars or Zoom calls. And in 2021, we were still under COVID protocols, especially in Canada. So these were all done remotely. And, and I don't recall how long they were, maybe 90 minutes each. And I believe they were actually recorded. So there was a series of those type of things. They sent us a bunch of documentation that we did, I did read through. I didn't dwell on it extensively. It wasn't, it wasn't like all that illuminating. It was just a bunch of boilerplate and common sense type of directives. But I did skim through it. So there was a level of training. I have no idea whether it constituted 14 hours.
Thank you.
So, sir, just to clarify too, are you saying that training agreement you just read is similar to the one you had seen previously, but you can't match it exactly? So,
It looks familiar, yeah.
okay. Thank you, sir.
Did you attend any testing of the Titan in the Bahamas?
I did not.
You stated also earlier that you were aware the Titan was an experimental submersible, but were you aware that the Titan wasn't classed or tested or registered? Was that ever brought up to you?
I was well aware of that. And there were no protocols in place, as I understand it, to test a cylindrical carbon fiber fuselage for for deep ocean diving. So I don't believe there was any facility to actually test it at that level. So Stockton, and again, this is my understanding, Stockton would have had to create the whole testing protocol in order to test his own ship.
Did he ever go over the testing protocol that he conducted with you?
Only conversationally. And I don't recall the exact conversation, but I mean, I'm certainly was aware of their previous dives, and you know, I discussed it with PH and Stockton at length, and no one tried to deceive me that this was a safe or easy operation, but you know, I was comfortable going down with them.
I'm going to kind of move to the Titanic Expedition 2021. Again, I know we briefly talked about that with Lieutenant Commander Williams. As discussed, you were on that test dive to the Titanic wreck site for dive 62 on July 3rd, 2021. The dive that only descended to 1,700 meters. When did you pay to be a part of that dive? What year?
I believe it was within 6 months of the launch date. So it was, I approached, it was in the first quarter of 2021, because I approached Dave around Christmas, New Year's, and told him I wanted to go, and he connected me with OceanGate. So it would have been in the first quarter of 2021.
And what was the purpose, again, of that dive? It's listed as a systems test. What were they testing, to your awareness?
They were testing to make sure the Titan could go to depth.
Lieutenant Steele, can you pull up Coast Guard Exhibit 052, which is the dive log and maintenance log, and go to page 2? This is kind of hard to read, but we'll try to zoom in to dive 62. And on the right, as Lieutenant Commander Williams stated, it states that there was a loss of the starboard thrusters. Can you scroll down to page 14? This is, page 14, this is part of the maintenance log section. And if you look under dive 62 on July 3rd, 2021, there are several issues listed, and some are dive critical. And that was the dive you were on, correct? Dive 62 on the 3rd of July.
Yes.
Okay. I'm just going to read them for the record. It states, incident, external hull HPA valve set in the wrong position for the dive. Starboard control pod failed at 1,700 meters after pop sound heard, 0 vacuum, 0 temp, green water alarm. 2 drop weights jammed in the starboard channel. Number 1 and number 3 acoustic sensors have extreme and unusual events, thousands of hits with 5,000 to 6,000 levels only. All other sensors appear normal. Dome hinge retention plate bent, DVL intermittent, external lights flickering and drawing 14 amps, pan and tilt not functional, port battery will not turn on, rear axis camera mount broken, and sub comes off the platform in a rough launch. Were you aware of all these incidents during your dive or after your dive?
Well, I had forgotten that they had an acoustic event down below, but yeah, that does ring a bell now that I'm looking at it.
So I'll ask you to go into that acoustic event, but I'm going to ask Lieutenant Steele to keep this up on the screen and have you go through these from your point of view as a passenger when you're inside the submersible. Can you kind of take us through these incidents and what they look like to you from inside the submersible? You had already talked about the thrusters.
Yeah. Well, and I talked about the weights being jammed. Mm-hmm. We couldn't get them off. The acoustic sensors, yeah, and now that I'm looking at it, I do recall, I mean, they were all discussing everything that was happening in a group setting. I didn't necessarily understand the nomenclature they were referring to, but I recall concerns with the acoustic sensor at depth, and the dome hinge retention plate, and I don't recall that. The DVL intermittent, I don't recall. The external lights flickering, yeah, I remember that. The pan and tilt, yeah, we had issues with that. We had issues with the battery, and no, that was the other mission. We had issues with the scrubber, but I think that was 2022. I don't remember the camera being broken, and the rough launch we talked about. Yeah, and I mean, I recall most of those.
Did any of that cause you any concern while you were inside the submersible at the time?
Well, there wasn't anything I could do about it. I mean, we just had to get back to the surface. And I wasn't unduly, there was a level of concern. I just figured we'd sort it out and return to the surface.
How did the acoustic sensors and the monitoring, was there like a screen inside that they pulled up? Like, what did that look like?
I believe it was on the laptop screen, but again, I didn't understand what I was looking at. So, to ask me to explain what they were talking about, it was all over my head. I knew that they were monitoring the whole, but I believe it was on a laptop or an iPad or something.
Yesterday, we heard witness testimony from another mission specialist. They described the hull to be very quiet on dives. Was that your experience as well?
Generally.
The pop sound that's listed there on the second item, did you hear that sound?
Yeah, we've had a couple, pop. The one up top was the loud and alarming one, but yeah, there were a couple noises.
And this, just to differentiate, that was on dive 80, but this was on dive 62. Was there another? It says that 1,700 milliliter pop sound.
I don't recall any loud sounds on 62, no. It was, the only loud one was on the 2022 mission.
Okay, thank you. You can take that down, Lieutenant Steele, thank you. Did any employees of OceanGate or past employees ever bring up safety concerns to you?
Safety concerns regards the operation of the Titan.
The operation or the construction of the Titan?
Well, I never personally met David Lockridge, who was the main critic, but I was aware of him, and I was aware of some of his concerns. I don't recall specifically talking to OceanGate employees that had concerns that were expressed to me in any really coherent fashion. I mean, there were always general discussions, about the safety of the ship and making it a safer environment. But I think what you're asking is, did somebody tell me that it wasn't structurally intact and I shouldn't get in it? And that never happened.
How were you made aware of the concerns from Mr. Lockridge?
I believe David Kincannon filled me in on that reality. He knew David, and he knew of the past issues.
Can you kind of go through that conversation with Mr. Kincannon about that?
I don't recall the exact context of the conversation. It was just a conversation about the evolution of the Titan, and I don't even remember when that conversation was. But yeah, I do remember talking about his concerns, and also one of the elements of that discussion was that most of the concerns that were articulated by that group of people that wrote the letter, that was a previous iteration of the Titan, and some of those concerns had been addressed in the construction of the Titan that I was on. So you have to clarify, as I'm sure you're well aware, that a lot of the complaints that David Lockridge had and that the panel had when they wrote were about the previous iteration, previous submersible, and some of those issues were tested and corrected in the construction of the Titan.
Was there ever a time you were on a dive in the Titan that you ever felt unsafe?
And that goes back to the original mandate. I mean, it wasn't supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be a thrilling adventure. In a broad sense, I didn't feel completely safe at any time, but I never felt personally that I was. Well, we got stuck momentarily in the Titanic, but with Stockton. But he was absolutely unflappable, and I was sitting at his right shoulder, and I'd asked him to go around where the brake was, and we had, for a few moments, we had gotten stuck, and I said, and he was very quiet, and he was working the controls, and did I say Stockton? I meant PH, and I leaned over and I said, PH, it seems that we're stuck, and he says, yes, Fred, we are, and then he got it out, and we went on, and I tried to reach the stern element. So yeah, and that moment, I don't think. In fact, everyone else on the sub at that point wanted to go back to the surface, but I prevailed upon PH to making a shot for the stern, which we attempted to do until Wendy got concerned about what we were up to and told us to come up immediately. So I answered your question.
And can we just, for clarification, which dive was that on?
That was the 2022 dive.
Okay. Dive 80?
I'm sorry?
Dive 80 in
Yes,
2022? Yes. And who was on that dive again with you? I know you just said PH was on that dive with you.
Well, PH was on both my dives, and Scott Griffith was the pilot during the free fall, and during the ascent, PH took over flying in the nose when we were actually at the wreck site. And we were accompanied by two other mission specialists, the father and son, Colin and Richard Talon out of St. John's.
Can you kind of tell us about your relationship with Mr. Rush? What was that like?
I really liked Stockton and had a lot of respect for him. Like I said, he was a brilliant visionary. He was an inventor. He had this idea of exploring the deep and colonizing it and leading humanity into the last great frontier. And I admired him. We did occasionally have differences on certain things that I discussed with him, and for someone who was a risk taker, I got the impression he thought I was a bit of a troublemaker, not in a negative way, just kind of a carefree, tongue-in-cheek individual who enjoyed the process maybe more than I should. But so the one year at the end they gave a bunch of awards out, and of course I was awarded the Troublemaker Award. So we got along fairly well, but I also was well aware that there were times that I tested Stockton's patience.
Were those moments that you tested his patience, were those while you were in a submersible, or can you kind of go into that?
No, it was just breaking rules, the standard rules on the ship.
That you were breaking rules?
Yeah, we'll just, yes.
And when you say the ship, are you talking the support vessel or the Titan?
The support vessel.
Mr. Neubauer, that's all the questions I have.
Thank you. Sir, we've been going over an hour. Would you like to take a quick break at this time?
If anyone up there needs a break, feel free. Otherwise, I'm at your disposal.
Okay. Well, I'll just do my line, and then we'll take a break, sir. I just have some follow-ups from the initial 2 rounds of questioning. First, going back to the incident involving the dome, sir, did you observe the incident as the dome fell off?
Yes, I did.
Do you recall which side of the dome was on the deck of the vessel?
The outside.
And did the dome slide down the ramp?
A short distance, and I got stuck. I actually have a picture of it on my phone.
Yes, sir. I'd like to get that after the proceedings, to the board, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And the picture you have, is it of the dome stuck on the ramp?
Yes, I was on deck, or, I was on board when it blew off, but then afterwards I got out in the, the little Zodiac, and I took a picture from the Zodiac, and it's looking right up the ramp, and you see the dome laying on the ramp.
And sir, just to clarify, it was, I think you said face down, it wasn't on the ring side, but on the front of the dome?
It was the exterior of the dome, yeah. It fell forward, and it bounced and got stuck. I mean, it weighed 3,500 pounds. It wasn't easy to move, so
Yes, sir.
it didn't flop around.
How did they recover that? Do you remember?
I believe they had a crane on board, so they basically rigged it and lifted it up and reset it. And then that's why the next dive was supposed to be basically a test to make sure that everything worked, and I insisted on going.
And along that line, sir, who made the call that you shouldn't go on the dive?
Well, they allowed me on the dive. I'm not sure I follow your question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'll rephrase. Who made the initial call that you shouldn't, as a mission specialist, be part of that dive?
Well, Stockton, I think, made a very logical decision that they should do it with their inner team, and and PH wasn't going to be left out of that, and Scott was the co-pilot, so that was the team that was going to descend, and I prevailed upon him to let me participate.
In your opinion, was Mr. Rush the final authority for safety issues?
In my opinion, yes.
Did you ever have a discussion about the U.S. Coast Guard with Mr. Rush?
The U.S. Coast Guard.
Did the U.S. Coast Guard ever come up in any discussions with Mr. Rush?
Probably, but I don't recall. I mean, the Canadian Coast Guard stormed aboard the ship in 2021, armed with AR-14s, body armor, and sidearms, and I still don't understand what they were after, maybe to check and see if we were wearing our mask or something, but I have no idea what they were doing or why they were heavily armed with body armor, but four of them came ashore when we returned from the mission where we lost our thruster. I mean, came on board, but that was the Canadians. I'm sure he talked about the U.S. Coast Guard, and I'm sure it'd be very entertaining if I remember what he said, but I don't remember.
And sort of clarify the record, are you familiar with the Canadian maritime structure? Are you sure that was the Canadian Coast Guard?
No, I'm not familiar with their structure, but I would assume that if they had body armor and AR-15s, they were a fairly significant element.
So just for the record, the Canadian Coast Guard is a civilian force that is just search and rescue, and so that it's probably another Canadian authority.
It very well may be. Whoever came on, and I thought it was the Coast Guard, they were heavily armed, which was startling. I don't think that has any bearing on this hearing. I just mentioned it in passing. I thought it was the Coast Guard.
Sir, going back to Dive 80, you mentioned that the Titan was entangled for a short period of time. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Do you remember what the Titan was entangled with?
Yes, for my own reasons, I wanted to investigate. The ship broke in half, and normally everybody wants to see the iconic bow shot or the recognizable components, which I wanted to see as well. And we kind of descended a little bit into the grand staircase because the skylight was gone, and so we saw all the normal iconic sites, and I wanted to investigate the area of the rupture, and I asked PH to get back. And of course, there's a lot of current swirling around, and we briefly got stuck. It was just like pipes and things, and PH very quickly. When I say stuck, we weren't stuck. I doubt if it was more than a minute or two. And we were definitely stuck. Yeah.
And just to clarify, the Titan was entangled with the wreckage of the Titanic. Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Do you remember what part of the Titan was entangled?
I think we just snagged one of the skids on some pipe or something. I don't think it was that big of a deal, but yeah, I mean, obviously, when you're down there, it feels like a big deal. PH certainly wasn't overly concerned, and he very quickly piloted the Titan away from, and released it.
Thank you, sir. Those are the extent of my questions. Before we transition to the National Transportation Safety Board, I'd like to take a recess.
Sure.
And we'll reconvene at 9:50. This hearing is now back in session. Mr. Hagan, I just had one follow-up question before we go to the NTSB. In regard to the incident with the Titanic, was that reported to topside, to the Horizon Arctic?
You mean when we got stuck?
Yes, sir.
I mean, I may be overblowing the whole experience. I mean, we had a skid stuck for a minute, maybe. It wasn't a big deal, and I'm sure it was discussed. I don't remember.
Was there a discussion after the mission was over, topside?
I don't remember.
At this time, I'd like to go to Mr. Muse.
Good morning again, sir. I just have a few follow-ups. Do you hold a merchant mariner's credential from the United States or any other country?
I do not. You said mariner credentials?
Yes, sir.
No, I don't.
When you entered Canada, did you enter as a tourist or as a seafarer?
In 2021, I entered as a mission specialist.
Were you instructed to tell customs or immigration on your role in what you're doing there, either as a tourist or some other function?
Yeah, I was told to tell them that I was participating in the mission and that I was a member of the team that was going to go down on the submersible, which was correct. I mean, I was also a paying mission specialist, or as you say, a tourist. I did not use the word tourist to the Canadians because I did not think it would be conducive to them allowing me to enter the country, especially with their onerous and anal interpretation of COVID protocols.
During the visit, or as you said, when they stormed aboard in 2021, was that? Do you know? Was that when you came back from a mission, or were you sitting there doing training, about to go on a mission?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the first part?
When the Canadian authorities came on board,
Oh, yes.
was that? Were you sitting there waiting to go on a mission, or was that when you came
No,
back
no,
from a mission?
that was when we returned and we towed the Titan back on the platform. We pulled into dock and immediately 4 heavily armed individuals, came on board, much to my consternation. And I initially thought they'd finally caught up to me, but it turned out it was all just some perfunctory bureaucratic snafu. I to this day, have no idea what they were doing.
Okay, thank you for your time today, sir. I have no further questions.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to go to OceanGate for any questions, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hagan. Just one question. You mentioned the brief entanglement with the Titanic debris during Dive 80. Was that intentional on the part of OceanGate?
No, it certainly wasn't intentional. It was completely my fault, and nobody's fault but mine. I was egging PH on, but it was not intentional, and it really was not a big deal. I don't want to overstate that at all.
That's it. Thank you.
Mr. Fawcett, I understand you have a follow-up question?
Yes, sir. Thank you for being here today. My name is Keith Fawcett. So I just want to go back to Dive 80. Who made the final determination on the cause of the loud noise that was observed when the Titan reached the surface?
Scott Griffith and Stockton were the two that were actually taking responsibility to investigate that, and they jointly made that determination.
Talking about the pre-dive checks, if you'll sit there for a minute and just think of yourself back in the Titan hull when you made those dives, was the process for the pre-dive checks an orderly process, as if they were following a checklist or a procedure?
Yeah, it would be similar to the checklist you'd use on an airplane. You just go through and mark off things, and they were also talking, by radio, I believe, on the surface to people outside who were also responding, like they were checking off items on a checklist. I don't recall exactly what those items were, But yes, it did seem like an orderly process, and there was attention paid to any anomalies or incidents. And like I said, that's why out of 100 attempts, they only made 13 actual descents to the Titanic, because of the attempt to follow a protocol. And as soon as you got past their threshold of tolerance, they aborted.
During the missions that you were on, do you recall the pilot or OceanGate personnel inside the Titan saying that all of the real-time acoustic sensors were properly functioning as part of the pre-dive check?
I don't remember.
And then you mentioned getting stuck on the Titanic wreckage.
Well, I'm sorry I mentioned it, but yeah.
Do you, prior to your dives, did OceanGate tell you, pardon me, that they had notified the Canadian or the United States Coast Guard of the mission or the expedition so that they would be in a position to assist you if something like entanglement on wreckage or some other problem occurred on the ocean bottom?
No, but I did have clear conversations with at least PH and probably others. The conversation as related to me was that there are few assets on Earth capable of getting to depth, and that if something went wrong, that we were all going to die, and PH related that repeatedly. That was a common conversational thread, I think, on board, was that there were limited assets. They probably could not be organized logistically and scrambled in time to save anyone if something went wrong. And that was the paradigm that we had to be comfortable with.
Did OceanGate ever tell you that they had notified potential contractors or other submersible operators of the expedition so that they would be ready in the event there was a problem in the vessel, the Titan was on the ocean bottom?
I don't recall that.
Thank you, sir. That's all I have, sir.
Mr. Hagan, I have a question about your perception of Mr. Nargelet's role at OceanGate, or during the role during the excursions. Did you understand him to be an employee of OceanGate?
No, he was an employee of RMS Titanic, Inc.
And can you explain the process for the piloting on board for Dive 80? Like, was it either Mr. Griffiths or Mr. Nargelet?
Scott basically was in command during the free fall, which there's not a whole lot to do other than free fall. When we got near the bottom, they moved the controller into the nose, and Scott was flying by referencing an onboard camera, an external camera. PH took over and did the visual flying by the wreck site. And I believe everyone was aware that PH was not an employee of OceanGate. He was there as an expert. He was, his nickname was Mr. Titanic, and he was just this warm, vital, extremely likable guy that you couldn't help but feel comfortable with, regardless of who you were. And he was a wonderful addition to the team. But when I say he wasn't an employee, I think everyone also viewed him as an integral part of the OceanGate team.
And was part of that to provide kind of a narration as a guide?
Oh, yeah, he would definitely, PH was definitely a draw, and he was such a wonderful human being that, he just added, a special element to any mission that you were on with him, and even on board ship, he just, he made it a pleasure, to endure even the most mundane experiences.
Understand. At this time, are there any final questions for Mr. Hagan? Mr. Hagan, do you have anything that would be valuable to the board that we have not asked you?
Well, if I'm done, I'll just, express my thoughts very briefly. I don't know if it's any value to anyone, but, one of the concerns that I have is that the world at large viewed this from the outset as this disaster where somebody had to be blamed, and without access to the facts. So first off, I want to profoundly thank this board for your attempts to deliberate what happened in a calm manner and come to the facts in hopes of preventing a recurrence. At the same time, I think my worry is that the greater tragedy than the OceanGate tragedy is if we use this event to inhibit future innovation, and if the regulations derived from this may prevent that kind of innovative approach to the undersea world. The depths of the ocean are fundamental to life, and the elements that are going to sustain us in the coming green economy need to be harvested in a sustainable fashion. So we need ways and means to access that. And the government has not currently been investing the resources to do that. So I think it's up to private enterprise to help, and hopefully with the help of the government, just as the government is working with Elon Musk. And Musk is hoping to colonize space, and I'd love to go there with him. But I did go with Stockton. He was hoping to explore and colonize inner space, which is the last great frontier. So hopefully it's a teachable moment. If you know history, in 1934 we had the airmail fiasco, and it was a disaster. The Army Air Corps tried to fly the airmail with planes, open cockpit planes that only had magnetic compasses, and it was a catastrophe. But it was a teachable moment. And from that moment, the United States had a competition for manufacturers to make designs for the next generation of airplanes, and one of them was the B-17 bomber. So the only reason that we were even somewhat prepared for World War II evolved from that teachable moment. And I'd like to think that this is a teachable moment, and my hope is that, if nothing else, the government and private enterprise team together as they have with Elon Musk in space, because inner space and the depths of the ocean are much more important in the short term than outer space. So it's critical, and I thank you all for your time. I will express I was unhappy with the Coast Guard during the disaster, and again, as it turned out, there was nothing that could have been done. But in the moment, those of us who knew and loved the people on board, we wanted every effort made to save them. And I believe there was a reaction to this, that there had been an acoustic event, and that they had been lost. And it seemed to me, from my perspective, that we should have scrambled the few assets that could have been scrambled in order to effect a rescue rather than a recovery. And I believe there was an asset in Buffalo that was not sent out. So even if there was evidence suggesting an implosion, my feeling was that we should have pursued every possible avenue until we knew definitively that my friends were dead. And if for no other reason, I believe it would have been an opportunity to test those systems and to put them on site. And I don't believe that happened. That's my only criticism. And again, I'm not blaming anyone. I just wish that it happened. But I do thank you for your inquiry, and you've been very calm and deliberative, and I appreciate your tone, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Just for the information, for the record, we do have Coast Guard witnesses coming to testify about the search and rescue efforts next week. Excuse me. Mr. Hagan, thank you for your testimony. You are now released from these proceedings. If we need further information from you, I will contact you directly. If you need further information about this hearing, you may contact our recorder, Lieutenant Kelly Steele. At this time, the hearing will recess and reconvene at 10:20.
Thank you very much.
This hearing is now back in session. At this time, we will hear testimony from Mr. Dave Dyer, University of Washington Applied Physics Lab. Okay. Mr. Dyer?
Yes.
The recorder will now administer the oath.
Okay.
Good morning, sir. Could you please stand and raise your right hand for me? A false statement given to an agency of the United States is punishable by fine and/or imprisonment under 18 U.S.C. 1001. Knowing this, do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you're about to provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
Yes.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you.
Mr. Dyer, thank you for being here today.
Yes.
Lieutenant Commander Williams is going to start with your questioning, sir.
Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Dyer.
Hi.
Thank you for being with us here this morning. As we ask you questions, we will take breaks. If you need a break, please let us know.
Okay.
All of my questions are related to your background and your experience with OceanGate.
Okay.
Before we begin, I will ask you to please refrain from using acronyms. If you should use an acronym, I will stop you and ask you to explain what that acronym means. Can you please explain your background and history before you became involved with OceanGate?
Yes, I have a degree in ocean engineering from Cal State University, Long Beach. Right after graduation, I started working for Rockwell International in their marine autonomy group. Most of that was working on advanced submarine warfare projects. That involved submarine communications, it involved boundary layer control, and it involved sonobuoy type technology. From there, I moved over to Hughes Aircraft, working in the dynamics group, so we would do the analysis for shuttle and Ariane and Titan launches to determine how satellites would survive or have issues with the launch. During that time, I also did some work with GM. GM purchased Hughes Aircraft shortly after I was there. I did a little bit of work on some of their solar-powered cars, specifically looking at their carbon fiber structures for solar panels. At that time, after that, then I moved up to Washington, working for Hughes Aircraft at a Boeing facility, was working on satellite integration, so that was looking at the entire satellite systems, integrating it together, doing the testing on it, and getting it ready for launch. And then I participated in the launch support for those satellites. Then I moved over to Boeing, started working for Boeing in the Sea Launch program, worked there for a period of time, and then moved into their Advanced Composites Research Group, where we were really given free rein to work on whatever projects we felt were applicable to Boeing and what they were doing. Then moved over to Precor, doing exercise equipment. Started off in the consumer part of that, working on the actual products, and then I was put in charge of the research and development group. And we were responsible for kinematics, so how does the equipment interact with the human body, and the exercise physiology portion of that, making sure that people were able to use the equipment to the best of their advantage on there. Then moved over to Applied Physics Lab, was brought in specifically to work with the associate director on bringing new programs into the lab, whether they were ONR, Office of Naval Research, or DARPA, which is Defense Advanced Research Programs Administration, I think is what that one is. Working on programs on there, so those were things where we would do conceptual work, looking at underwater vehicles, crawlers, things like that, that would be applicable to what Office of Naval Research and DARPA needed to do. That was when we, at that point in time, about halfway through that, Mr. Miyamoto started working on developing what he called the collaboratory, and that was meant to be an interface between industry and the university. And the goal of it was to give industry access to research that was going on in the universities that they normally wouldn't have access to. And then we would also work to help them find partners that could help them through technology. So most of the companies, when they start off in these high-tech things, they don't necessarily have all the expertise on their company. So we would help them find people that could come in and kind of bridge that gap for them. And that's really how we got started with OceanGate, is we used OceanGate submersibles, the existing ones that they had. I believe it was SUDS at the time is the one that he used. We used that for obstacle avoidance program. that we were working on for Office of Naval Research.
Who initiated the conversation between OceanGate and the University of Washington Applied Physics Lab?
It's hard to tell who initiated that. Bob and Stockton were talking together. Bob sought Stockton out to use their submersibles. And when Stockton started talking about what his vision for the company was, Bob offered to have APL come on and help him get going on there. At the time, OceanGate didn't have any engineering capability. So the idea was that we would come in and provide that engineering capability while they built up their engineering staff. And at that point in time, we could then step back and just come in occasionally or be advisors to them from that point on. So I believe it was kind of a lunchtime discussion between Mr. Miyamoto and Stockton.
And how did the relationship start out?
We started working with that project on them, the obstacle avoidance program. And then once it was determined that we were going to help them out, Mr. Miyamoto and Stockton put together a contract, and that contract was a very wide open contract. It was meant to be something that allowed a lot of flexibility in there. It allowed us to come in and go in and out on these programs as needed by OceanGate.
And what year was that?
That was about 2012, 2013.
And how far along was the design of Cyclops 2, which later became Titan, when you started working with OceanGate?
Cyclops, we started working with Cyclops 1. Once Cyclops 1 was working, we started working on Cyclops 2. So when we started that contract with them, Cyclops 2 was on the books. It was just something that was to be worked, but we had not started off on Cyclops 2 right off the bat.
And are you aware of how far along OceanGate had gotten into the design process for Cyclops 2 at the time?
I think it was all conceptual stuff from Stockton. I don't think they had really any design work at that point.
Were you involved in any conversations for the carbon fiber hull, where the hull was originally designed from 10 inches, then to 7 inches, and then it was finally 5 inches thick?
We were involved in some of those discussions. I believe that started off with Boeing, working with Boeing on that. I don't ever remember it being up to 10 inches. I do remember it being closer to 5, somewhere between 5 to 7 inches under that part. Then Boeing worked that for a while, and then it was shifted over to Spencer Composites that continued working on that.
So the University of Washington Applied Physics Lab didn't have any maybe stock in changing it from 7 inches to 5 inches?
No, we were not the carbon fiber experts. We were relying on the other ones, and that was part of our deal with Stockton of, if we don't have that expertise on there, we will help them find someone. We pointed them to Boeing because of our work that we had done with Boeing and some of the composites. And then Stockton later shifted that work to Spencer Composites.
What was your experience working with the operations department of OceanGate?
I worked fairly closely with them. I'm a huge fan of when you're developing something, you work with the people who are going to be the end users of it. So I worked closely with the operations group when we were doing the Cyclops 1 vehicle. And then early in the process of Cyclops 2, we were still continuing that relationship with them, working with them. And I would describe it as a very good relationship.
Lieutenant Steele, could you please bring up Exhibit 16, the University of Washington research proposal on page 2? Mr. Dyer, are you familiar with this document?
Yes.
And what was your understanding of the intent of this research proposal?
The intent was to provide engineering expertise to OceanGate as they work through the design of Cyclops 1 and then moving that into Cyclops 2.
Lieutenant Steele, could you please scroll down to page 4? I'd like to draw your attention, can you scroll up just a little bit? Up. Thank you. I'd like to draw your attention to the number 6 and number 7 of the technical approach outlined in your proposal.
Yes.
Can you explain to me the importance of assessing performance and reevaluation?
That's huge. That's the key to success. You've got to be able to take your designs, prove the design through test and evaluation, and you've got to be able to understand what that test data gives you and understand what the impact is on the design. So it's crucial.
Now drawing your attention to the second paragraph on the same page. I think you might need to scroll down a little bit. The proposal states trade-off studies will be provided to look at the basic design and fabrication of the pressure hull, especially the mating of the pressure hull to the exterior viewing ports and necessary through-hull connections. Can you explain to me what is meant by trade studies?
It's looking at possible solutions. So when we start off, you'd look at it, you develop concepts of this is what we think can happen on there. And as you go through the design on that, you start refining it, start doing analysis on that, and based on that analysis, you refine your design even further. At some point in time, you can take a step back and you can look at, okay, we're heading down this path. This is the implication, or this is the impact of this design. Are there other alternatives that might be better for this? Are there trade-offs that we can look at that might benefit the program?
And were these trade studies to be completed by UW-APL, or was it to be done externally, or could it be a combination of the two?
It could be a combination of the two.
How much involvement did the University of Washington APL have with the design of the carbon fiber pressure hull?
We were involved in the initial concept on that. We were providing concepts, and the first group that we worked with was Boeing. And we relied on Boeing to provide their expertise for their carbon fiber. We were providing expertise for deep ocean work and what was required for that, so we were helping them understand what the loads would be and what those design requirements would be. But we were really dependent upon them to actually define and design the carbon fiber structure. We were involved in doing the interface between the dome and the carbon fiber structure, but again, that was in collaboration with Boeing. So as we would present ideas and concepts, they would take a look at it and give their feedback, and then we would take their feedback and either incorporate it or convince them that what we were looking at was adequate.
And Lieutenant Steele, could you please bring back up that exhibit and go to page 5, paragraph 2? At the end of paragraph 2, it states, testing of the pressure hull will initially be conducted without humans and then turned over to OceanGate for final safety approval and testing. Was the initial thought that UW-APL would test the full-scale pressure hull?
No, we didn't have the capability of doing that. If when they got to that point, if they needed our expertise or help in that, we were going to provide that expertise or that help in it. But we don't have the capacity to do the full scale.
At the time, did OceanGate agree to the initial testing that it should be unmanned?
Yes.
And what is the importance of conducting unmanned testing?
Especially something where you're pushing the envelope on technology. You're making changes that are not something that the industry necessarily is used to. You want to test that without human life involvement in that. You want to make that as safe as possible. So it'd be crucial to do those initial tests without a human involved.
Would you consider one unmanned dive to be sufficient before putting people on board?
No, I wouldn't.
In your experience, do you have an approximate amount of unmanned dives that would be appropriate?
I don't know if I could give you a number. It would be something where we would look at the data after each test and see what the data is doing, see if it's repeatable. Are you seeing change from dive to dive? And that would be the key for me for making a decision on how many you would need to do.
Lieutenant Steele, could you bring up Exhibit CG0? It's the email correspondence between the University of Washington and OceanGate, specifically page 15. Could you scroll down a little? Thank you. In that correspondence, the University of Washington states, to complete items 1 and 2, I will need some level of test data to ensure my FEA, finite element analysis, model adequately represents the carbon fiber hull stiffness and interface boundary conditions. Mr. Dyer, in your experience, what type of test data would be required?
Sorry, stand by for a moment.
You said that this is an email from APL. I just want to confirm, does Mr. Dyer recall this email? Is this his email? Because no names appear.
Yes, thank
on
you.
what he's looking at.
I think it's the first question. Mr. Dyer, do you recognize this email?
I recognize the content. I don't know if I could say I recognize word for word, but I do recognize the content, yes.
And are you familiar who it was to and who it was from?
I'm not. That looks like something that might be for me, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Lieutenant Commander Williams, do you know who this email is to and from?
Sir, my questions are actually relatively general, so I don't think it would matter who it was from.
In that case, do we need, I mean, what are we referring to on the document? We can ask him generally.
Okay. Yeah, but let's keep the questions very general, realizing that we don't understand who's behind this chain.
Mr. Dyer, what type of test data would be required to ensure your finite element analysis model adequately represented the carbon fiber hull stiffness?
Typically, when we look at the finite element analysis versus hardware, we look at strain data, we'll look at accelerations if they're appropriate, and we will look at the pressure chamber data as well. So as the pressure is applied to it, are you seeing changes in that profile as it goes down, unexpected changes in there, or does it look like the pressure hull is reacting according to what you thought it was going to react to?
In your experience, is this a required engineering practice when developing a new design?
Absolutely.
And do you know if any test data was ever received from OceanGate?
The first test that I recall them doing was a scale hull test of a carbon fiber hull. It was I don't remember the scale, but it was a relatively small pressure vessel. That had strain gauges in it. That one failed prematurely. It failed before it reached the design depth on there. And I believe that data was provided to either Spencer or Boeing. I don't remember who it was that laid that hull up. Whoever laid the hull up, it was provided to them. And then the second or follow-on test, that one included accelerometers for the acoustic emissions system in there. That was data, that was about the time we were phasing out of there, and I don't recall ever seeing the data from that. I know that the data was collected, but I don't recall seeing that data.
Thank you.
Commander Williams, we've confirmed that email, Mr. Dyer, was from you to
Okay.
Mr. Nissen.
Okay, thank you.
We understand that after the design aspects of Titan were absorbed in-house by OceanGate, the University of Washington Applied Physics Lab was still utilized for pressure testing. As we understand it, there were third-scale model testing and component testing completed at University of Washington Applied Physics Lab. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. The last test that we were actively involved in was that scale model that failed. The rest of those were tests that OceanGate did on their own without us necessarily being involved in that.
Were you involved in any of the third-scale model testing?
Just the first two cylindrical models, the ones that failed prematurely. Yes, we were involved in those.
What was your experience during these tests?
The first one, the data was collected and provided to, and again, I don't remember if it was Spencer or to Boeing, but the data was provided to the group that did the analysis on that. They built a second one because of that failure. The second one had carbon fiber end domes on there because that was one of the goals that OceanGate wanted to try and see if they could achieve. That was another one that failed. And again, that data was provided to the company that did that layup, and I believe that one, I'm almost for sure that one was done by Spencer because of the dome portion of it. We didn't see the data on any of those that I can recall.
When you say it failed, can you explain what you mean by failed?
The first one collapsed. It was a catastrophic failure. The second one was also a catastrophic failure, but I believe it was the domes that failed as opposed to the cylindrical section.
Were you involved in conversations after those failures with how to make design improvements?
No.
In your experience, would you recommend constructing a full-scale hull if there was not a successful third-scale model test?
Yes, I actually would have recommended to continue with the third scale until you had a success before you did the full scale for cost purposes.
Switching subjects now to the real-time monitoring system. Were you involved in the real-time monitoring system?
We spoke to Boeing about that. They were the group that had the experience with that system. We asked Boeing if they would provide that system or put that into one of the third scale models so that we could take a look at that and see how that would benefit the program. So we were involved in getting that set up, and we worked with Boeing to get that installed into the system. I was there during that test, and I saw the data being collected on there. But again, we did not get that data. That was something that was between Boeing and OceanGate. I believe we saw the final report on that, but we were not involved in the analysis of that data.
What was your impression of the engineering department at OceanGate?
It was a tough group to work with. They had a different mindset on how to proceed with the program than we did.
Can you please expand?
Excuse
they-
me, Ms. Wil-
Yes.
Could we clarify what time period we're talking about when we refer to OceanGate engineering team? Thank you.
Yes, I think that's important. What date are you referring to?
This is around the 2015-2016 timeframe.
Yeah. The biggest difference, the part that I struggled with the most is, in my experience, when you have a system, you evaluate it as a system and you look at fabrication and the implications of fabrication as a system. Mr. Neeson wanted to isolate those. He wanted to look at just the carbon fiber hull, just the dome, as individual components. And where we really started butting heads is when we were looking at the fabrication of the titanium dome. I wanted the foundry to see what the entire system looked like so that they could provide feedback if they saw anything that they thought was suspicious or that they wanted to put some caution to. And Tony didn't want to do that. I provided that information to the foundry, and that was when Tony really got upset, and that was shortly after that is when we were removed from the project.
Why did OceanGate and University of Washington Applied Physics Lab stop working together?
It was the engineering. We were butting heads too much on there, and OceanGate felt that it was better to terminate that and let their group take over the engineering.
What was University of Washington's Applied Physics Lab impression of the glass spheres for propulsion?
For propulsion, the housing, glass housings.
Yes.
We like glass spheres. Those are things that are used in the industry, and they're nice and reliable. But they do have some unexpected failures that most people can't explain, typically at significant depths. We did not like the idea of using glass spheres on a manned vehicle, especially when they were going to the depth that they were trying to go to. Had it been shallow, we would have been okay with it, just because of the energy would have been somewhat constrained. But at the depths that they were going to, we didn't like the idea of those spheres out there. If they had an implosion, that's a pretty catastrophic implosion, and we didn't know what that could potentially do to the pressure vessel, to the hull.
And did you make these concerns known to OceanGate?
Yes.
And is that one of the reasons, or is that the only reason that University of Washington Applied Physics Lab and OceanGate stopped working together?
That was one of the reasons. That was probably the final reason on that. That was kind of what ended that relationship. But that was not the only reason.
Can you explain what some of those other reasons were?
It was, like I mentioned before, just the mindset and the philosophy on engineering and developing a new product. We'd had too many conflicts on how we would go about doing that.
What was your opinion of the submersible, specifically Cyclops 2, which later became Titan? What was your opinion of that submersible at the time? that you, that OceanGate and Applied Physics Lab stopped working together?
With the initial concept, it was early enough in it that we felt like there was a very good chance it could be successful. The design looked like it was heading down the right path on there. Once we severed that relationship, I don't really know the direction. I would hear bits and pieces. I don't believe Stockton and I talked for quite a while after we severed on there, so I was only hearing bits and pieces of information on what was going on. But we actually felt fairly decent, like the direction. We knew that the design was not complete, and it was not ready to go full-scale fabrication by any means. But we felt like it at least had a chance of heading down the right path.
Were there specific design aspects that you recall as to, that were not completed before you and, before the University of Washington and OceanGate went your separate ways?
Yeah, the carbon fiber hull final design was not complete in my mind. We had some preliminary FEA on there. We had the third scale test that had some failures in it. So in my mind, that design was not complete. Because of those failures, they had not figured out what happened on those failures from my perspective. And I had not seen an effort to modify or to change the design based on what they saw in there. The titanium spheres, that was about the time we left is when they were shifting away from the glass dome on the forward part. They were going more towards titanium spheres. So that was very early in the design process. We had done enough work to say this is the ballpark so we can at least talk to foundries and start getting a feel for what it would cost to fabricate this and how they would go about doing that. But the design was nowhere near complete on that portion of it either.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Lieutenant Commander Whalen?
Good morning, Mr. Dyer.
Hi.
I want to discuss, or before we move away from the topic as we had just discussed, the 17-inch glass spheres, which were the motor pod controllers, which were external to the pressure vessel.
Yes.
Can you explain the importance of those as for the propulsion of the Titan submersible?
Yeah, those house the motor controllers and the interface between the internal electronics in the sub and the external. So that was the interface to those motor controllers. And the motor controllers are the device. They're the electronics that control the actual thrusters themselves. So those house the motor controllers and that interface electronics.
And in providing your professional and technical opinion to OceanGate at that time, had you conducted your own technical research as to what a failure of one of those would do?
We only heard anecdotally of the industry and experiences of researchers who had used those in deep ocean work. Typically, when they failed, they lost the entire vehicle, meaning the vehicle either completely shut down or the vehicle was completely lost. Prior to that, I believe there was a Hui vehicle that had been operating fairly deep. I think it was deeper than 6,000 meters, and they lost that vehicle. And the reason for that, the potential reason for that was they believed that the glass spheres had failed and taken the vehicle out. I don't know if that was ever proven or not, but that was what was suspect at the time of that failure, and that was about the time that we were pushing back on using glass spheres for the manned vehicle.
So within that statement, you used the acronym HUI. Can you please tell me who
That's
HUI is?
Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute.
And then, sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
And then you also, by lost, can you please explain what lost means?
It's my understanding that the vehicle, they did not recover the vehicle. If they did recover the vehicle, it was probably in pieces, but my understanding is it was a non-functional vehicle at some point in time during that dive, and they believe that was because the glass spheres had failed.
Is there ever, did you uncover or discover any evidence as to the amount of pressure or that would be caused by one of the failures of the sphere at the depth of 4,000 meters?
We had a young engineer that was assisting on other programs, not the OceanGate one, but he was curious and he ran some numbers on it, and it was pretty astounding, the amount of energy that was released. I don't remember the numbers, but it was it was significant. It was as though a bomb had gone off. And again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was eyebrow raising.
Was it close to about a half kilogram of TNT explosion?
That sounds about right.
Thank you. How familiar are you with classification societies and the classing of submersibles and/or vessels for commercial purposes?
We were working with Stockton on the classification process when we, through our process, and by the time we were no longer involved in the process, it was my understanding they were still pursuing classification at that time. He had considered several organizations, and he had talked to several organizations. I remember having the GL group, it's Gerschmidt Lloyd, I'm sorry, it's a German name I can't pronounce. But they were one organization that had a standard for manned submersibles. And that was a group that he brought out to talk to them about what we were doing and things like that. So yes, we were involved in him looking at certification of the manned submersible.
And at that time, were there classification rules or standards allowing carbon fiber as a pressure vessel for human occupancy?
No, it was unique to the industry. And when the GL representative came out and talked to us, they mentioned that they had a person on staff that would look at the carbon fiber hull as a system and evaluate how that would be classified. They didn't necessarily have an issue with it. They weren't concerned with it. They just knew that they would have to look at it differently than they did a steel hull.
So in your opinion, the classification society was open to innovation, but it would require time and testing?
Yes.
Were you involved in any of those? Were you involved in any of those meetings firsthand?
When the GL representative came out, I was involved in the meeting that took place over maybe an hour or two, but that was the only time that I discussed that specifically with them.
And what were some of the important points that you found within that meeting?
It was a pretty general discussion, so I don't know if there were any specifics talked about other than the fact that since it was a carbon fiber hull, they would have to look at it differently than they do a steel hull. They had regulations that were very defined in steel and titanium hulls. They didn't have anything specific for carbon fiber. So it was going to be something that they had to look at a little bit differently than they did with a normal metal hull.
Was that the only meeting that you were involved in with DNVGL?
Yes.
Did the communications continue pursuing DNVGL and the classification of the pressure vessel?
It's my understanding that they did. Stockton did start looking at having them certified just the hull and then later just the propulsion. So we're looking at system by system, having them certified system by system, as opposed to trying to do the entire sub in one foul swoop. But it's my understanding that they did continue to communicate on certifying the hull.
In the end, did the hull, to your knowledge, ever get certified by DNVGL or any other classification society?
I'm not aware of it.
Okay. And just to clarify for the time frame, and while we know that there were two Titan hulls, this was the first hull and then around 2016, 2017?
Yes.
Okay. You had mentioned the Cyclops 1.
Yes.
And the majority of your work was done on the Cyclops 1 to act as a prototype, not prototype, but act as a test bed for the applications that were going to be used on the Cyclops 2 and Titan, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Were you involved in the process from when those applications went from Cyclops 1 to the Titan, and how did that transition go?
That transition took place, the majority of that took place after we were no longer involved in that. So I'm not real sure on how that transition went.
Okay. And did you take part in any dives aboard the Cyclops 1?
No. I supported a dive. Actually, I'm sorry, I did not. I did not support a dive.
Did other members of the faculty in the University of Washington Applied Physics Lab take part in any dives?
I don't believe so. I'm not aware of that.
Were you involved or were you made aware of any incidences that happened while on test dives for the Cyclops 1?
I'm sorry, you asked Cyclops 1.
Yes, sir.
I was involved in a dive on the Cyclops 1 that they did in Flower Gardens. I supported those dive operations, which the Cyclops 1, to be clear, was the steel-hulled version. Yes, so I was involved in one of those dives on that.
Correct.
And I did go down, I went down in Antipodes. I did not go down in Cyclops 1.
And can you tell me a little bit more about the Flower Gardens dive on the Cyclops 1?
Yeah, the intent of that dive was to reach a depth of 500 meters. The goal that Stockton had on that was to get it certified for 500 meters. So that we went out to the Flower Gardens area, got the sub prepped, put the people into it, and they did a dive. I don't remember if there was more than one dive. I remember one dive specifically. I don't remember if they did multiple dives or not, but I do remember one dive specifically.
And you use the term certified. Was certified to a classification standard?
So it was certified, it was a certification group, and I don't remember the name of the group that did that certification. But they had a representative out there to participate in the dive, so he could verify that they had gone to a specific depth.
With Lieutenant Commander Williams, you discussed the titanium domes and rings.
Yes.
Can you tell me the difference between grade 5 and grade 3?
Grade 3, I don't remember the specifics of grade 3. Grade 5 is a higher strength titanium, which is it's typically 120,000 pounds per square inch yield. I don't remember what grade 3 is. Grade 3 may be in the casting realm. I don't remember that specifically.
And if you were to do a finite element analysis utilizing grade 5 as your titanium or for your domes and your rings, and actually conducted the build utilizing a grade 3 titanium dome and ring, would there be a measurable difference in your opinion?
I would have to look at the specs for grade 3. But if you design for grade 5 and you go to a different grade, you've got to make sure that the analysis encompasses the specs for that material. Since I don't recall what grade 3 is on there, I can't answer that specifically. I can just say that looking at grade 5 to grade 3, I would need to make sure that those specs were the same if I was going to assume that the analysis was valid for both.
Did you do any work in designing the launch and recovery system?
Yes.
Can you tell me about the launch and recovery system?
Yeah, we did. We worked on the first one. There was a second one that was the one that was used on the later dives. We did work on the first one. We took stocks and concept of how he wanted it to function, and we worked to make that a reality. That design was 2 barges. They were barges that were pretty standard in the barge industry. They were made in a modular fashion so that they could be taken apart and then shipped across road or on trucking without having special permits. Those barges were aluminum. I believe they were steel. A steel hull that had internal structures. They had 3 compartments that were separate from each other so that we could flood and purge the compartments independently. And then they had a system on them that allowed us to flood or purge each of those compartments independently so that it could go submerged as well as come back up to the surface.
And what did you believe to be the purpose to utilize this barge system?
The goal behind it was to open up the realm of what surface ships could be used for their operations. Typically, if you have a manned vehicle like the Cyclops vehicle, any cranes that would be on board had to be man-rated, which really limited the number of ships that you had access to. Ship time is very expensive, and it's very difficult to come by because ships are utilized almost 100%. They have to be in order to be functional. So it was really to open up the realm of what you could use, what access you had in order to support dives. This allowed them to put the vehicle on the barge at port so that you could load the vehicle without humans in it, and then tow it out to site, transport people over to it, and then launch and recover them without the use of a man-rated crane.
And did you ever witness this operation with the Cyclops one?
Yes.
And in your professional opinion, do you believe that it worked, it functioned properly?
Yes, I do.
Is this an operation that's used widely throughout the submersible industry?
I don't know that. I know that it was used, University of Hawaii had a system like that, and I believe that's where Stockton got the idea. I believe that's the only other group I know of that uses a system like that was University of Hawaii.
While you were working on the project, did you have any interaction with Lloyd's, the Classification Society, Lloyd's Register?
Just the one meeting where they came out to talk to Stockton about classifying the hull. So that was the GL group that I referred to.
So just to confirm, it was Lloyd's.
They were Gershwitz, Lloyd's. That was the group that came out to discuss that. I don't know if that's separate from Lloyd's specifically. They were known as GL at the time. I believe that's now changed to Lloyd's Registry. I don't think GL is out there any longer. But when we were talking to them, they were referred to GL or Gershwitz, Lloyd's.
We'll look into that. I just want to get that for the record.
Yes.
They're different
Yes.
classification societies.
Okay.
You discussed Boeing in a previous project that they had completed and you worked with them on.
Yes.
I don't remember the exact name, or I forgot the exact name, but it was a underwater vehicle made of carbon fiber.
Correct.
Was that a pressure vessel for human occupancy?
No. No, it was a smaller vessel. It was meant to carry a payload, and it was meant to be deployed and sit down on the seabed at pretty significant depths for a period of time, and then come back to the surface on its own.
And was it the same relative size and depth rated?
It was 6,000 meter rated, and it was much smaller significantly smaller than Cyclops.
Thank you, sir. That's all the questions I have for now.
Thank you.
Mr. Dyer, would you like to take a break or?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, we'll keep going then, sir.
All
I
right.
just have a couple follow-up questions
Sure.
from your initial testimony. Can you further explain the concerns or the break you had with OceanGate regarding the domes fabrication?
When we were working on the domes, the fabrication part of that, we were working with a foundry who had a significant amount of experience in doing large titanium castings. I didn't have the experience doing large titanium castings. All of my experience with castings have been relatively small, and it's pretty straightforward. Large stuff, I think, is a little bit of a different beast. This group specifically did large titanium castings, and they had several contracts with the Navy on large titanium castings. So combined with their group that was working on it, they had probably over 150 years' experience of doing these castings. I wanted to tap into their resources as much as I could because I didn't want to rely on my background alone. I just didn't have what I felt comfortable with. To do that, I wanted them to look at the entire system. So they saw the titanium dome, the interface ring, and the carbon fiber to see how all that went together and how that all made it up so that they could see the full picture. I wanted to make sure that they understood how it was being used and that whole system. In the event that they saw something in there or they had experience with something that I didn't know about or was unaware of, so that they could help us through that design process. That was not something that OceanGate Engineering wanted to do. They wanted them to look at just the dome. For some reason, they did not want them to see the carbon fiber hull or the interface ring. They wanted them to look at just the dome.
And I realize we're still talking about the prototype Titan
Yes.
hull. But would it be important to match the contraction rates between the titanium and the potential carbon fiber connection point?
Yeah, that was one of the things that when we did the conceptual stuff, that was something that we were concerned about. We wanted to make sure that the deflection between the dome and the cylindrical portion matched as close as we could. We didn't want non-uniform compression on there. So that was something that we worked on, and that was, we specifically made the dome elliptical shape, and we specifically modified or had the interface ring designed in a certain cross-section so that we could try and match those two deflections.
And so I'm now just thinking about the shape of the Titan prototype, and actually the cylindrical shape of it.
Yes.
Would it be possible to build a steel or titanium hull in the same shape?
Of the cylindrical shape yourself?
Yes, sir.
Yes, you can definitely do that. It becomes very heavy. Its displacement to buoyancy ratio becomes problematic. It's doable, but you end up having to add a substantial amount of external flotation in order to make sure that it can still float. The whole purpose behind a carbon fiber hull is you get to a point where the carbon fiber hull has enough buoyancy that you don't have to add extra flotation to it. Now you're just adding ballast to it to take it down and to trim it out. That's the benefit of a carbon fiber hull.
From a material standpoint, could you build a steel hull if you're willing to do the buoyancy provisions that could reach the Titanic, or would it have to be like titanium? Do you know?
It could be steel. I have not actually run the numbers, but based on other pressure hulls that I've done, you could definitely make it out of steel if you needed to.
And before I shift over to the NTSB, sir, I just want to make a couple clarifications for the record. Germanister Lloyd is the GL class society that merged with Det Norske Veritas
Okay.
in 2013.
Okay.
So a GL and DNV are some acronyms that we're using today. So just for the record. At this time, I'd like to go to the NTSB.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Dyer, and that was the clarification I had as well. I have no further questions.
Okay.
Yes.
I'd like to go to OceanGate, please.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer. Just one question. You mentioned the testing of one-third scale models at the APL facility that you were doing with OceanGate. Did OceanGate continue to utilize APL facility for those tests after APL was no longer analyzing the data, as you said, for those?
Yeah, just for clarification, the pressure vessel is a UW-operated pressure vessel, not an APL pressure vessel. They're distinct organizations. With APL is a part of UW, but we don't have the chambers to do that. So that's run out of the School of Oceanography on campus at the University of Washington. My understanding is that they used that pressure chamber several times after we were no longer involved in the program.
Understood. Thank you.
Mr. Dyer, we've been going for a while. I'd like to take a 10-minute recess and to see if we have any final questions for you, sir.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Great. This hearing is now in recess, and we'll reconvene at 11:20.
I'm sorry? Oh, no, thank you.
The hearing is now back in session. Mr. Dyer, Lieutenant Commander Williams has a follow-up question for you.
Okay.
Mr. Dyer, you mentioned Stockton's vision. What was Mr. Rush's, or at least what was your opinion of Mr. Rush's vision for the company when APL and OceanGate first started working together? Specifically, was it related to oceanographic research, exploration, tourism?
When he first started, our impression was that he was focused on the research aspect of it, trying to make access to manned exploration more accessible for researchers because it was so expensive otherwise.
Did that change throughout the time you worked with OceanGate?
He changed in, not in his ultimate goal. His ultimate goal was still to provide that for researchers, but his goal, I guess you'd describe it as opening up so that he could help to fund the development, further development of it. So he started opening it up to tourism and ultimately to the Titanic dives because that was his way of trying to bring money into it so that they could continue development to get to that ultimate goal of supporting the research industry.
Were you aware that OceanGate was going to take paying passengers during their operations?
He had talked about that with us. I don't know if he had finalized that or if he had decided about that. I did have lunch with Stockton a few times between when we stopped working with him and when on their last mission. So I knew that they were doing paid tourism on the Titanic at that point in time. I don't remember that being something that he decided when we were still working with him or not.
And to clarify for the record, what year did OceanGate and APL stop working together on the submersible design?
I believe it's about 2017.
At that time, did you have confidence in OceanGate's engineering department's ability to complete a safe design of a carbon fiber submersible?
I would say I was more questioning than lacking confidence. It was just questioning whether or not they would be able to pull that off adequately. I don't know if you call that lack of confidence. I was really questioning whether they could do it.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Yeah.
Mr. Fawcett?
Good morning, sir.
Hi.
Keith Fawcett.
Yes.
So you mentioned acoustic sensors on the prototype hull,
Yes.
and that would be the real-time monitoring acoustic sensors?
Yes.
Those are used to monitor the integrity of a hull or structure, is that correct?
Yeah, the idea behind acoustic emissions for carbon fiber or composite structures is to be able to detect any anomalies that are occurring when it's under load. They ultimately want to get to the point where they can identify where that event is taking place and characterize that event so that they can understand what that event means. In other words, is it just a settling of the structure, or is it a precursor to a failure? Ultimately, they want to be able to pinpoint where that event took place and the severity of that event.
So if you're using that system during a dive with a carbon fiber hull, would the real-time monitoring sensors be able to predict a catastrophic failure of the hull in time to protect the people engaged in the dive?
If the system had been properly characterized, it could predict when you were getting close to a failure of the system. In other words, if you understand what those events mean, you can start determining whether or not you need to get the hull out for NDT, or whether you feel like you've just exceeded what it's capable of doing and you need to put the hull up on the shelf for a museum piece. If it's properly characterized, you can use it for those types of situations, yes.
But while you're on a dive and you're at depth under extreme pressure, and you noticed and you had that system employed, would it predict, while you were on the dive, a catastrophic failure?
I don't think predict is the right word. I think it gives you an understanding of the integrity of the hull from dive to dive. You would make the decision before you even went down that the hull is usable for the next dive at the depth you're going, or it's not. I don't know that you necessarily want to rely on that mid-dive to say, wow, we need to get out of here and get back up. I think you need to use it more of a understanding the condition and the integrity of the hull before you do a dive.
So you would use it forensically and not during a dive? If you had a system on the dive that was, say, color-coded, where the display said red, green, and yellow, would that mean anything in the course of a dive to the people conducting the dive?
The only way that I could see that meaning something is if you went from
Sorry,
green to yellow.
Mr. Dyer, just OceanGate has a
Yeah, Mr.
question.
Newbar, I believe Mr. Dyer testified earlier to kind of, I just want to establish basis for knowledge, because we're putting a lot of facts here before Mr. Dyer without establishing that he knows this.
Right. I think a good question here is, Mr. Dyer, were you aware of a color coding system on the acoustic monitoring system for warnings?
I was not aware that it had been implemented. I was aware that that was there, they wanted to do that. But I was not aware that it had been implemented.
Okay. So the basis of this question is, if it were implemented, what would your opinion be, sir?
Yeah, I think the only benefit in a dive would be if you've gone from green to the next level. If you see a change from that green status down to one of the other status mid-dive, I would think you would want to abort the dive. I wouldn't wait till you get to a red status. A red status, in my mind, means a failure is imminent.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Commander Whalen.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer. You had mentioned observing a dive that took part in the Everett Marina. There was a safety event or near-miss report for a dive that happened on April 30th of 2015. Were you part of that dive?
I don't believe I was. I think that was Pete Brodsky that was part of that dive.
Did Mr. Brodsky share any of his experiences with you?
He mentioned that the hatch was leaking when they submerged, and it was decided to continue down and let the hatch seal itself under pressure. That's really all that he mentioned on there.
Okay, thank you. And we've been discussing the real-time monitoring system and the acoustic emissions and strain data.
Yes.
With regards to a carbon fiber hull, and speaking of acoustic emissions, what is that acoustic emission that it's measuring?
The way that those systems work is they have accelerometers that are located at known locations throughout a structure, whether it's a pressure hull or a bridge or whatever. It monitors the response of those accelerometers. So it's looking for any sign that something has shifted, failed, the load path has changed, any event that accelerometer could pick up. Ideally, that system needs to be characterized so when you get an event on accelerometer, you know what that event means. It doesn't really do you any good if you just see an event. You don't know what that means, other than we had an event at this location. But the intent of it is to look and see if you can find some event that has given you some idea of what's happening in the structure. For a composite structure, they're looking for, are you seeing delaminations occurring? Are you seeing fibers break? Anything that would start compromising the integrity of that structure.
So an event may mean that the carbon fiber structure is breaking down, or the carbon fiber strands are breaking, causing an acoustic event?
It could mean that, yeah. It could mean anything in that system has made a sudden shift from what it was doing right before that event took place. So it could be a bond failure, it could be a fiber breaking, it could be a delamination occurring, or a bunch of fibers breaking. It could mean anything. That's why it's so important to characterize it before you rely on it to do much.
And were you aware of a way that OceanGate planned to utilize this acoustic emissions and strain gauge data to be able to localize and, over time, identify areas that had broken down significantly based upon the acoustic emissions?
Our understanding when Stockton was talking about it and when they started working on that system was that they would use that to help them identify when they needed to get NDD testing on there to verify if they're seeing something like fiber breakage or delaminations. I don't believe we were aware at the time that they were going to use that real time during a dive to abort it. I say that because when Stockton was talking about it, I cautioned him of saying, you've got to know what the data means, Stockton. If you think you're going to use that real time. If you don't know what that data means, it's useless to you real time. It doesn't mean anything to you. So we were under the impression that they were not planning on using it for real time, but for a predictive tool like we talked.
So, as you stated, this carbon fiber hull for pressure vessel for human occupancy, to your knowledge, hasn't been utilized in the past.
There was a carbon fiber hull that was fabricated for, I believe it was Fawcett or Fissett, was someone who was going to go to the Marianas Trench. And I believe that hull was fabricated by Spencer. I don't know the status of that. I do know that they had a failure on that. I don't know if they refabricated it or what, but there was a carbon fiber hull for human occupancy that was done by an individual, by a private citizen.
And was any of that, or was any data taken from that pressure hull to help?
When Stockton started considering Spencer, we talked to Spencer about that to try and figure out what we knew about that event and the data on that. I don't remember them having specific data on that. I think at the time there was still some questioning as to what exactly happened on that, whether it was a fabrication or whether it was an actual failure of the structure. I believe their conclusion was that there was an issue during manufacturing, and it was not because of the specific design or because of the material, but it was more of a manufacturing issue. That's my recollection of what they determined on that failure.
So with regards to the Titan, Cyclops 2 or Titan hull, to the best of your knowledge, what was the baseline data for which they were measuring the acoustic emissions and strain gauge?
I don't know. I don't know if they had any.
So
I don't know.
Okay, you weren't sure if there was any previous data?
When we were working with them, they didn't have any baseline data. They had used it for the first time in that scale version on there. That was the first time they'd collected data on there, so they didn't have anything to compare it to. So I don't know what transpired between that test and when they used it on the real hull.
Are you aware of what a delamination would look like in an RTM system?
It would be an accelerometer event. You'd see it show up on at least one accelerometer, probably multiple. And with those multiple, you should be able to then, after you've characterized it, you should be able to determine where that took place. That delamination might have a characteristic, I don't know, but it might be a different one than a fiber breaking. But testing should let you determine if you can tell the difference between a delamination and fiber breaking.
In your experience with carbon fiber, is there an unlimited life cycle?
My understanding is there is not an unlimited life cycle, but I don't know that for sure. That's my understanding.
Thank you, sir. That's all the questions I have, sir.
Mr. Dyer, would you feel comfortable talking about maintenance of carbon fiber?
Maintenance and
Just overall, how you should store and maintain carbon fiber hulls?
yeah, I don't think I would. I don't think I have expertise in that.
Sir, were you aware of the control systems that were used on the Cyclops and what were projected to be used on the Titan hulls?
We worked with Pete. Pete Brodsky was the one who did the control systems on there. We worked with that on Cyclops 1, so I'm somewhat familiar with that.
Were you familiar with the game controller
Yes.
operation?
Yes.
Did you ever have any concerns or voice any concerns about that system, sir?
The only concern we had on that was the wireless portion on that. And we made sure that the controllers that were being used had the ability to plug in to be wired. We didn't want to rely on Bluetooth alone. We were fine using Bluetooth as long as they had a fallback of being able to plug it in with a wire.
Could that be accomplished on the Cyclops?
Yes. Well, as far as I know, I believe they could drive it wired. They didn't have to rely on wireless.
Sir, thank you. Just at this time, are there any further questions from the board or for Mr. Dyer? Okay. Mr. Dyer, is there anything that we haven't asked you that would be valuable to the investigation? from
I
your view,
can't
sir?
think of anything offhand, no.
Mr. Dyer, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
You are now released as a witness from this Marine Board investigation. If we need to contact you for further information, I will contact you directly. If you have any questions about the proceedings in the future, please contact the board's recorder, Lieutenant Steele.
Okay?
Thank you again.
Yeah.
We will now recess and recess for lunch and reconvene at 1 p.m.
Thank you very much.